Let's make 2 at a time half square triangles. Here I've got my 2 squares of fabric that I'm going to use to make those HSTs. And we want to choose one square. It doesn't matter which one. I tend to default to the lighter square because we're going to make a mark, and it's typically, just depending on the tool you're using, might show up better on the lighter fabric. But whichever square you choose, we're going to turn it to the back side. And so on the wrong side of that square, we're going to draw a diagonal line from one corner to the other. So I'll just line up my ruler there through those corners. And you want to get it as precise as you can, and then draw that line, making it nice and visible. Great. Now I'm going to place this square right sides together with the other square for my HST. And I want to make sure all 4 edges are aligned as best as they can be. And if you want, you can throw a couple pins in here just to hold them in place. And now I'm going to take these squares to my machine, and I'm going to sew a seam 1/4 inch on either side of that line that I just drew. Here you can see those 2 seams that I just sewed, each 1/4 inch along that diagonal line that we drew. And now we're going to actually cut the square apart along that diagonal line. So we'll want to line up our ruler, making sure that edge goes right along that diagonal line that we drew through the center. Make sure you're not cutting along one of the seams. And we'll cut those apart. And now you have your 2 half square triangles. So let's go ahead and press them. You might be able, depending on the pattern instructions, you might press them open or you might press them to one side, but let's go ahead and get these HSTs pressed. Now that those HSTs are nice and pressed, we can get to trimming them down to the size that we need for the pattern. Now, of course, you want to grab a ruler that's at least the size that you need to trim your HSTs to. And in this case, I'm going to trim this HST down to 4.5 by 4.5. And it's helpful if your ruler has a 45-degree line that runs into the corner. It's definitely not necessary, but it is a nice additional guide, because the main goal when we're trimming our half square triangles, in order to get those really nice sharp points, we want to make sure that our trimmed HST ends up with that diagonal seam running directly into each corner. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to place my ruler on top of this HST, and trimming is going to be a little tight on this. But essentially there's a couple different check boxes that we want to check. One is that you want to make sure that even if it's very slight, that your HST extends at least a little beyond whatever dimension you're trimming to. So in my case, the 4.5 lines in each direction, I need to make sure there's just a little bit of fabric that goes beyond those lines while also having something exposed on these 2 edges of the ruler. And then the other thing, like I mentioned before, we want to make sure that that diagonal seam runs directly into the corners when we go to trim it. And that's where this 45-degree line is helpful. You can just use the corner of the ruler and the point of the square that you're trimming to. So in this case, it would be this kind of 4.5 by 4.5 coordinate. I would want to make sure that this point and the corner of my ruler fall directly on that diagonal seam. If you have that 45-degree line, that's just a nice easy check to make sure it runs along that seam of the HST. And so once you feel good about how your ruler is placed on your HST, you've got both the corner of the ruler and this point down here, or that 45-degree line along that diagonal seam. and you've got at least just a little bit, however slight, you know, some overage on all four sides of that square that you're trimming to, you can trim those two exposed edges. Okay. Now I'm going to rotate this 180 degrees, and now I'm going to line up these two edges that I just trimmed with those dimensions that I'm trimming to on my ruler. So in this case, again, the 4.5 by 4.5 lines are my guides here. And so I'm lining up those trimmed edges with those two lines. And hopefully, depending on how well our first set of trims went, that diagonal seam should fall back into or run directly through those two corners like we mentioned, or if you have that 45-degree line, it should run along there automatically, but you may need to just do some very slight adjustments. And once you feel good about that, you can trim those remaining two sides. All right, and there is your trimmed 2 at a time half square triangle.